Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Jeff Schulenberger, and this is Compact Conversations, the podcast where I sit down with one of Compact's contributors each week to discuss one of our articles. This week I'm joined again, a second time, by Phil Cunliffe, who teaches at University College London and is co-host of the podcast BungaCast, and has written for us recently about how Ukraine realists lost it over Gaza. Now, we originally scheduled this conversation a few weeks ago. For various reasons, we had to reschedule. So we're kind of coming back to this subject a couple weeks after the piece appeared. But of course, it's no less relevant. Unfortunately, the situation in the Middle East is still ongoing. There has been a ceasefire and, hostage exchange over the past week. We'll touch back on the piece as well as perhaps discuss some of the response to it. So thanks for joining me again, Phil.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for having me on again. Happy to be here.
So really excellent piece that's kind of about, more broadly, the sort of philosophy of realism in international relations. This is something that you study and have thought about quite a bit. It just so happens that 2 days ago, a monumental figure, Henry Kissinger, passed away, in a death that had been sort of expected and waited on for some years. And Kissinger is often identified with realism in foreign policy. This sort of ties into the theme of the piece because he's been a villain of the left, perhaps sort of the villain of the left when, left-wing sort of thinkers and commentators are commenting on American foreign policy of the past half century. And so, your piece is kind of about how the left makes use of and doesn't make use of aspects of this philosophy of realism, or at least some thinkers, some figures on the left. So I'm just curious what you make of Kissinger's legacy in relation to this subject of realism, as well as perhaps the particular position he occupies in the left's sort of demonology.
Yeah, so Kissinger is one of those people who, like you say, kind of has occupied a particular place in the left's demonology over the 20th century. Notwithstanding that, it was striking to me over the last, 20 years or so, that Kissinger, despite this reputation for being, the man who helped to overthrow Allende in Chile, helped propel the Khmer Rouge to power through the secret bombing of Cambodia, and generally had this reputation as the kind of ruthless Machiavellian, that he was nonetheless more critical of certain US foreign policy initiatives than many on the left were. And this, I think, speaks to the fact that so much of the left, broadly conceived, the left that kind of overlaps with liberalism, had accepted US foreign policy in terms of liberal hegemony, and therefore were far less able to criticize certain aspects of US foreign policy, particularly when it was framed in terms of defending human rights or alleviating human suffering. But nonetheless, despite these kinds of critical moments, such as Kissinger's skepticism over the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, his skepticism over the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and even his skepticism in Ukraine over and his concern about NATO expansion eastwards, he eventually kind of flipped and accommodated to the consensus and argued that once you're in the conflict, you have to find a way to resolve it on terms that are favorable to the US, because it becomes a matter of US credibility. So I don't want to overstate the extent of his critical purchase in the era of unipolar globalization. But it was striking nonetheless that he struck a note of explicit dissent from the viewpoint of national interest in a way that the left was unable to, precisely because the left wasn't willing to think in terms of political self-interest or national self-interest, but only in universal and moralistic categories such as the spread of human rights, defending or alleviating human suffering, or even spreading democracy and buttressing democracy around the world. That's, I think that gives some sense of his limited degree of kind of critical insight he's had over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, and it's interesting the way he's used the left's moralism as a foil, seemingly deliberately, right? That he's sort of cultivated, and our columnist Malcolm Chiuna wrote about this just today. This kind of aura of amorality, and in a sense, part of what's interesting about the left's, and after he died, of course, we had this barrage of kind of denunciations and so on, consigning him to hell on the part of people who don't believe in hell and that sort of stuff. But he actually kind of deliberately cultivated this as I understand it. He was happy to be viewed that way in some sense.
Yeah. I think it was part of the grift, so to speak. It was part of his mean, he set up his political consultancy fairly early in the 1980s. So, before the Cold War had even ended, he was quick on as part of the fact that he helped to engineer the rapprochement between China and the US. He was very much part of China's integration into the global economy and helping to smooth the path for the Chinese Communist Party and its entry into world affairs in the 1990s and in the 2000s. And so I think that kind of, like you say, the cultivation of that aura of Machiavellian duplicity and amorality was part of that pitch. It kind of was part of a sales pitch for the political advice that he continued to give to governments, and also the fact he was making money off it. By all accounts, did well out of it, made good business. So, I mean, I think, I'd agree with Malcolm to that degree that it was kind of a deliberate ploy, part of a cultivated persona. And the left were, happy to prop it up to some extent as well, as part of, and this kind of as part of an unconscious way of buttressing their own moral claims in the wake of the Cold War as well. So, it was... you can read, I think, there is a way to see it as a very kind of, as a cynical game of reputation burnishing, both in positive and negative aspects.
So moving towards the left here, part of what you've been saying so far in relation to Kissinger is that Kissinger embodied this approach to foreign affairs, which, he remained an influential figure through his consultancy and so on, as you described. But nonetheless, the kind of animating force of foreign policy shifted away from this kind of cold, calculating realpolitik, at least in terms of how it was kind of legitimated and talked about, and towards these various forms of kind of universalism and humanitarianism. You mentioned the intervention in Yugoslavia, which is maybe the most revealing in some ways of this new ethos, where you had, these kind of former New Left figures. Like, I remember reading a bunch about Joschka Fischer in Germany as, this figure of the, 1968 New Left sort of anti-imperialist moment, who really became a kind of animating figure in the new imperialism, at least according to some, justified by these human rights ideology. And you had, of course, the neocon version of that in the 2000s. And so, you've had various versions of this kind of idealistic moralism, right? And this has animated really the center, both the center right and the center left of politics and foreign policy. So part of what I take you to be saying is that the left hasn't really figured out how to, and again, you have figures like Fischer who are very much figures of the left in its sort of last great influential incarnation who kind of helped shape this. And you have figures, Clinton, Blair, et cetera, who kind of come out of the era when sort of leftism was ascendant in student politics. So point being, the left has not figured out, since this new form of politics became ascendant, how to differentiate itself from that, or how to critique it really meaningfully. As perhaps Ukraine is, one illustration of, perhaps the most recent illustration of this. So am I characterizing your critique correctly?
Yeah, the 68 left in particular, like you say, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Joschka Fischer is a prime example. They became deeply committed to human rights liberalism as the realm in which it was possible and legitimate in a neoliberal era to use state power to achieve certain ends. In that post-Cold War period in which the left had effectively conceded that state power could no longer be used in any meaningful way to contain or mold, supplant the market, let alone to help institutionalize a post-capitalist system, the international realm was the realm in which state power could be used in order to radically change societies, at least in the sense of extending human rights, relieving human suffering, defending democratic values, supposedly, and spreading democracy at the point of the bayonet, as it were. The left was, the 68 left was very much implicated in this. I mean, there are many strands to the argument and to the critique, but it takes us right through up to NATO's expansion eastwards and also to the conflict in Ukraine. The conflict in Ukraine is at a juncture in which transitioning into a different kind of world order. And that's significant because the way in which NATO expansion was framed that helped precipitate the crisis and the Russian invasion of Ukraine was justified in these universal moral terms of the the need to kind of defend liberal democracy around the world, the need to consolidate human rights, the need to consolidate a particular vision of the state. And so it was framed in universal terms, but that was the overhang from the era of unipolarity. Human rights and that kind of 68er vision of human rights foreign policy, that belonged to this era of neoliberal globalization that was coming to an end if it's not already come to an end. And so it's abutted the reality of renewed geopolitical rivalry that can't be purely understood or cashed in terms of human rights abuses and human rights defenders, but rather has to be understood in terms of balance of power, of geopolitical rivalries, of strategy and national interest. And so this is where the left has had difficulty trying to integrate its or trying to develop a response in Ukraine. And so you have the perverse, you have this completely absurd and perverse sight of so many Western leaders who are happy to justify the bombing of other countries and, the violation of their sovereignty, to particularly such as the new foreign secretary here in the UK, David Cameron, who is the man who wrecked Libya in terms of defending the human rights of Libya's citizens against their own government. He destroyed Libyan sovereignty and destroyed the Libyan state. And here he is kind of claiming to champion Ukraine's sovereignty and Ukraine's territorial integrity. And so you see the tension there between a politics that belongs to the unipolar era and politicians struggling to carve out a political response to an era where power is much more contested. You can no longer take for granted the overwhelmingly dominant character of US power that allows for these luxury-style beliefs, such as the spread of liberalism around the world and defending human rights.
Yeah, it was striking to me in response to Ukraine, the ways that it did and didn't echo what happened with Iraq 20 years prior, that, on some level, you sort of had actually Putin himself and various of his, direct supporters, like not just sort of people accused of being Putin supporters, but sort of actual Putin supporters sort of saying, if the US gets to do Iraq, why shouldn't we get to do, this country quite close to us? So there was that level of it. But then on the level of the international response, whereas with Iraq, it seemed quite easy for the left to see through the sort of human rights rhetoric and sort of democracy rhetoric of the Bush administration, or the Blair government in the UK. And so you did have a kind of, massive lining up of kind of sort of liberal universalist sort of hawks behind the Bush administration around Iraq, famously, infamously. You definitely also had a left, and, this was when I was like a student and going to these protests and so on, that could really take a critical stance from it. The comparison in the UK is interesting because, like, here it was definitely in part because it was a Republican administration that it was possible to do that in a way that as soon as Obama came to power, it was much harder to galvanize people against the way, his continuation of many of the Bush sort of war on terror policies. It does seem like also on a conceptual level, it was interesting that people were able to kind of see through that and critique it, whereas far fewer were able to do that when it came to supporting the extension of NATO into further and further east, which is clearly kind of imperialist, and it's clearly of a piece with various other kinds of attempts to extend the reach of American power that the left was previously critical of. So it just struck me that people were able to kind of make that leap. And part of me thinks it was just because we had a Republican in office back then. But I think there's also more to it in terms of the kind of weakening of the left, that the left in a way has maybe gotten worse at this.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And don't doubt that part of the strength of the opposition to the invasion of Iraq was opposition to a Republican administration under George Bush that had become so committed, that was using the war on terror as a political vision that was pressuring the American left in all sorts of ways. I'm sure that was part of it, but I think, the extent of the left's criticism over Iraq was limited. And I think that's what has, set the left up for its inability to respond to Ukraine in any kind of meaningful way. So, I remember that globally, I attended at the time, I think it still is, it was the largest political protest in British history, when you had perhaps as many as 1 million people on the streets in London in 2003 before the Iraq invasion. And I attended the march myself. And it was the loneliest crowd I've ever been in. Like there was very few marches. Sorry, there was very few slogans. There was very little kind of feeling of cohesion or any kind of real sense of political purpose. There was a great deal of disenchantment with the Blair government of the time kind of pursuing this policy that was so unpopular with the British public. But I don't think there was really a meaningful sense of deep-seated political opposition to foreign policy. And this was borne out by both the opinion polls and also by the political speeches that were given during this march in 2003, because the overwhelming kind of consensus was that it wasn't the intervention in Iraq that was problematic. It was the fact that it was being done unilaterally. So the fact that Britain and America were doing it alone without the infamous kind of second UN resolution that the French were vetoing in the UN Security Council. So I think, had the intervention gone ahead with UN backing, I don't think the left would have been so vociferous in its opposition. So it was more a critique of the modality of the intervention rather than an outright defense of Iraqi sovereignty or territorial integrity, or a defense of the principle of non-intervention, or a defense of the principle of sovereignty. Rather, it was a dispute over the nature of the intervention. And so because the left wasn't willing at that point to defend the principle of national sovereignty or national independence, at this moment when the stakes had become so high over that question and so charged, it was unable to subsequently. And so the confusions and the knots that it's tied itself in with respect to Ukraine, are no surprise, I think, on that score, because the left hadn't really addressed the core issue. Had the invasion been a UN invasion, I think there would have been far less opposition on the streets and far less opposition on the part of the left in Western states. And that said, in Ukraine, even then, I think there's been, not entirely, but there's been some discomfort on the left because they're in this, they're more used to defending the human rights of people outside of Europe or, in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. And so it put them in an awkward position, I think, given their commitment to decolonization that they were seeking, and ended up trying to defend or trying to make the case for a European country that was being invaded. Because for most of the left, empire, imperialism, and so on is something that happens outside of Europe. The idea that imperial history is intertwined inside European history is something which is kind of anathema, an alien to the decolonial left. And so that also put the left in a very awkward position because they were unable really to talk about, or unable and unwilling to talk about the rights of people in Europe itself. And then finally, just a final point on what you said is, I think, like you say, the fact the Russians have retreated from the principle of defending sovereignty is also a very important part of it. And that happened a long time ago. That happened in 2008 when the Russians intervened in Georgia and separated out the enclaves of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And that was explicitly done with reference to what NATO had done in former Yugoslavia, in Kosovo. And so the Russians deployed the same rhetoric, the same kinds of human rights justifications, the claim to be defending an ethnic minority from a genocide pursued by the central government in Tbilisi. And so the fact that there is no major significant player in world affairs that claims to be defending the principle of territorial integrity or the principle of sovereign independence indicates what a sorry pass we've come to. Because up until 2008, that had been the claim of the Putin government. He had always said that we stand for the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries. And that was abandoned in 2008, was abandoned in 2014. They annexed Crimea and obviously abandoned more recently with the annexation of the eastern oblasts of occupied Ukraine.
It sounds like part of what I would take away from what you just said is that, the piece that you wrote was kind of about the shift in some, you did have a sector of the left that was, more critical of the Western stance on Ukraine, right? And tended to frame this in terms of a kind of realist stance, right? That you had to sort of understand the sort of national interest of Russia and, its own sort of rational assessment of its position. And so you had to, frame the conflict that way rather than just in these kind of moralistic terms. from what you just said, and then, the piece then discusses how the tone and mood of the conversation around Israel and Gaza has been extremely different and often from many of the same sort of corners. There's a level of this where you could just say, and thinking of like this, the website, The Gray Zone, right, which, is roughly, is often accused of being just straight up sort of pro-Putin, pro-Assad, et cetera, but, has sort of framed its skepticism about the West, Western intervention in these places in a more or less sort of realist way. Whatever, Putin and Assad may not be the best leaders we can have, but at least they provide some kind of stability and order. You brought up Libya. There are good reasons to support that basic position. Israel's response to Gaza has been, I would say highly moralistic, focused entirely on the humanitarian disaster unfolding in Gaza. So that's maybe one extreme example. But then you have a lot of kind of commentators on the left who were, skeptical of the way humanitarian rhetoric was marshaled in response to the Ukraine war, but have now, essentially adopted a kind of humanitarian standpoint when trying to comment on what's happening in Gaza. There may be good reasons for that. It is a humanitarian disaster, no question, but it is interesting to see the kind of selective realism versus humanitarianism sort of rhetorical deployments. Going back to what you just said, what strikes me is that, in some ways, the Israel-Gaza, it feels like a kind of revival of you pointed out the ways that Ukraine is kind of a difficult case for the left because it's in Europe, but it's also a kind of, object of imperial aggression. And so it's kind of out of the comfort zone. In many ways, sort of Israel-Palestine really is the comfort zone of the anti-imperialist left. It's probably kind of it's a position on which, or it's an issue on which everyone had their positions worked out decades ago. And so on some level, one might argue it kind of enabled a default back into a relatively comfortable position, whereas Ukraine was in some ways more confusing. So, part of the way I read it is that it's enabled this kind of weird regression back into positions that people formulated decades ago. So it feels very oddly kind of like a fallback into this position. But if Ukraine revealed kind of some risks and limitations of the left's perspective, what are the risks and limitations we're seeing in their response to what's going on?
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think there are aspects of the Israel-Palestine conflict that are a comfort zone for the left, and that stretches right back to the 1970s and the kind of iconic images, which I think many of the left, even if, they're obviously, the millennial left are too young to remember the 1970s, but nonetheless, that legacy of kind of guerrilla struggle of romantic 1970s third worldism is something that still has its allure, particularly for a left whose so much of their political adult life has been shaped by the era of post-politics and technocracy. And so I think that allure which the Palestinian national struggle has is magnetic in many ways for the left. But at the same time, part of the reason, the other part of the appeal is the fact that and this is the point I make in the compact piece that I wrote, is that the Palestinian people have been defeated. And so the stakes of talking about their struggle are much lower because it doesn't require you to think through the nature of a conflict in which the Palestinians could conceivably win, or what kind of political vision is on offer on the part of the Palestinians, or what the political project for the Palestinian people might look like. So none of those basic questions, and then let alone all the kind of follow-on questions that would come from answering those basic questions, none of those have to be addressed or even thought about. Rather, what is left is trying to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people from the Israeli assault. Those two things, I think, make the Palestinian cause very alluring, is precisely the defeated character of the Palestinians, so that they're victims, essentially, rather than active agents in the conflict or in the region, and the fact that you have still this kind of third worldist appeal. And I agree with what you said, that there is this regression on the part of some people on the left from a willingness to think in terms of multipolarity, from thinking in terms of what are the geopolitical underpinnings of any particular kind of regional conflict, what are the shifting tides within that conflict? Where are the kind of the stable positions? What's at stake in that conflict? Those kinds of questions, which, some brave and hardy souls on the left were willing to ask, and often at great personal cost, in terms of their public profiles and their careers, they were willing to kind of make those questions around Ukraine. They seem to have been abandoned over the question of Gaza. And instead, there's been this retreat into thinking of the conflict in humanitarian terms. I mean, it offers, like you say, it offers relief from thinking through the political aspects of the conflict. It makes it easy Manichaean question of human rights oppressors and human rights victims, blameless innocence and kind of utmost depravity. And so between those two poles, it doesn't require any actual political analysis. And so it seems to me that what's happened basically is, it's Gaza in some ways has become the last redoubt of liberal globalism for the left, the last place where they still talk in terms of human rights, in terms of genocide, all the kind of ideological, all the discourse which has been undigested and left over from the 1990s and the 2000s. From the era of humanitarian intervention, from the era of liberal universalism, from the era, that kind of peak era of globalization and NGOs and global civil society and so on, all of that is being concentrated into the conflict over Gaza at the expense of understanding or trying to think through what the politics of the conflict is.
Right. And I mean, I suppose to, try to provide a qualified defense, I suppose, part of the reason for that would be that the politics are perhaps especially gnarly in this case, in part because we don't have a conflict between two sovereign states. Instead, between a sovereign state and although, part of what's interesting is that Israel itself is often defined as somehow exceptional. I don't necessarily agree with this, but it's interesting how it's often framed as being a kind of exceptional instance of a sovereign state, right? Whether it's because it's settler colonial or whatever. Be that as may, the point is, you do have one sovereign state, although one that's, struggled to gain recognition as such and is still not recognized as such in many quarters. And then you have another people that has never been able to constitute itself as a sovereign state or as the basis of a sovereign state. It obviously is it's a very different kind of conflict, and trying to think about the politics of it is very difficult, including, I would say, for the actual, the Israelis and the Palestinians themselves, who seem to be in different ways kind of caught up in an extreme sort of short-sightedness. Remarkably, this expose just came out in the New York Times that kind of detailed how the Israeli intelligence did actually have a sort of detailed, the access to a detailed plan of the attack that ended up occurring on October 7th, but, just didn't quite believe that it could happen. We've seen many other examples of this in recent history where like the intelligence people actually get hold of this plan, but then they don't believe it or won't believe it, possibly in this case, in part because acknowledging that it could be real was too inconvenient for the Netanyahu government's strategy up to then. It does seem like everybody has trouble thinking about the politics of this conflict in any kind of systematic way, including the people actually shaping it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, it is more gnarly, like you say, than an instance of even, I'd say Russia and Ukraine, given their intertwined history, the kind of the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO expansion eastwards, internal tensions between East and West in Ukraine. I mean, that's gnarly enough. But, like you say, kind of at the end of the day, it is still a war between two sovereign states, even if ones who are, share so much history. Whereas in the case of Israel and Gaza specifically, you have a sovereign state in this kind of territory, which is effectively a protectorate of Israel itself. And so it is more complicated, but nonetheless, that is politics itself. That is the challenge, the political challenge, is to try and think through such complexity. There is what I think is borne out by the brutality of the conflict, the aimlessness of the Israeli assault, the seeming lack of any kind of meaningful post-war vision for Gaza coming out of Israel, speaks to the fact that it is only politics that will resolve we need a political resolution of the conflict. And so framing it purely in terms of moral outrage over civilian suffering serves no one's interest. I think you're right. I mean, that on the part of the participants themselves, there seems to be very little appetite or will to think through the political implications of the conflict. Though I would say, I think that's less forgivable on the part of the Israelis than is the Palestinians. I think it's less the fact that the participants in the conflict find the political complexity of the conflict so challenging for themselves is less forgivable on the Israeli side, because the Israelis are the ones who have the most power in the conflict. They're the ones who won, essentially. As far as my read of this is essentially as far as why we are where we are, it's essentially drawing on Edward Said's analysis from the early 1990s that the Palestinian Liberation Organization effectively surrendered to the Israelis at Oslo, the Oslo Peace Accord, so-called, were a Palestinian Versailles. And so the Israelis won, and that they are the ones who hold the cards. They're the ones who have the power in the situation. And it's their unwillingness to realize the fruits of their victory that means their unwillingness to take responsibility for a defeated people, for the people in the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Palestinians in Gaza, means that their unwillingness to integrate them into Israel or to form any kind of durable political settlement for the region means that this is the situation that we're in, that the Palestinians, they have no meaningful political options. And so in that situation, it's unsurprising that an Islamist group such as Hamas has been able to feed off the dissatisfaction with the PLO, the dissatisfaction and the Israeli oppression, and the general stasis and impasse of the so-called peace process.
One of the responses to your piece came from sometime Compact contributor Ben Burgess in Responsible Statecraft. And, he is somebody who I think has had smart commentary on both conflicts. One of these figures on the left who I think got a lot of criticism for not kind of going all in for eastward NATO expansion and all of that, and for advocating for compromise and peace in Russia and Ukraine. And so and he is somebody who's been very critical of Israel in its response in the past 2 months. So did you get a chance to read Ben's response? And I'm curious what your thoughts on his take was.
Yeah, so Ben wrote a response to my Compact piece, like you say, in Responsible Statecraft, where he took issue with my characterization of this regression from realism over Ukraine to liberal moralism over Gaza. And he questioned it on two counts. He said there was no inconsistency in the response because there was, the case for, as he put it, restraint is a moral one rather than one of, it's not one. It's there is a moral consistency in being critical of Israel, but also critical of Western policy over Ukraine. And I suppose I think Ben Burgess in his response that he mischaracterizes my argument in two ways. So he mistakes my criticism for a moral one rather than a political one. So I wasn't claiming inconsistency among the left realists. I wasn't calling them out for being inconsistent, but rather using their inconsistency to draw attention to the fact that their response has essentially been humanitarian in Gaza because they've been unwilling to think of it in political terms. The dispute is over the framing of the conflict. And I think to frame it in humanitarian terms, to frame the conflict in humanitarian terms, as I said, is to not really think through the politics of the situation. And so in that context, it reinforces a moralistic approach to the conflict. So I think, the other element that Ben Burgess said in his piece was that he didn't recognize what I portrayed in terms of the degree of support for the Palestinians, the strength of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign. He accused me of living in a different dimension. To which I would say, I suppose the different dimension is maybe Europe, because the strength of support for the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign is much stronger in European states than it is in the US, But I think even in the US, he mischaracterizes the shifting tides of opinion, which are certainly more shifted in favor of Palestinian solidarity than they ever have been in the past. And that's evident with the squad, politics of the squad in Congress. It's evident with all the campus protests in university. Even a most recent story where a senior figure in the CIA got into trouble for putting a pro-Palestinian statement on their personal Facebook page. And then there was also the kind of pavement revolt by bureaucrats in the Foreign Service in protest at Washington's overly pro-Israeli stance. I'm not denying the fact that there is plenty of hostility, even authoritarian and dogmatic hostility to Palestinian solidarity in the West, throughout the West and especially in the US. But I don't think that changes the fact that there is a definite shift, particularly on the left and on the younger left, in favor of the Palestinians and away from the Israelis. Whether or not that's good or bad, welcome or not, I wasn't really trying to make a claim on that one way or the other. But what I do think it speaks to, like I say, is the fact that whatever that solidarity is, it's essentially humanitarian sympathy. It's humanitarian sympathy for Palestinian suffering. And it is not sympathy that will help resolve the conflict, because it is not support for a Palestinian political project. So they might talk in terms of Palestinian freedom on the protest marches, but that means nothing when the dominant force in Gaza is an Islamist organization that has no particular durable commitment to civil liberty or national independence or political rights. I mean, they're an Islamist organization. They want a united Ummah. The idea of a sovereign secular state that would be part of a larger international order comprised of independent nation states, that is not part of Hamas's vision. Talking in terms of Palestinian freedom at the same time, whereas Hamas is one of the if not the leading exponent of Palestine at the moment, is, it's meaningless. It shows the contradictions in the left's position, the confusion between a supposed political stance when a de facto politics of humanitarian sympathy.
Yeah, I mean, I made my own comment on this a few weeks ago when I happened to be in Washington, D.C. when there was a big march, pro-Palestinian march. And, at the time, what struck me was the emphasis on, ceasefire and saving lives. And, one thing that's been notable since then is I've seen a few smaller marches in New York, even in the past week, and they're still demanding now there is a ceasefire now. They're still demanding a ceasefire. So I guess they're demanding an extension of the ceasefire. But I think it speaks to the kind of post-political or apolitical dimension of this, that, there's not much of a program beyond just stop the slaughter, stop the killing, which is a fair enough sentiment, but it is fundamentally an apolitical one, right? And the saving lives point, I mean, of course, makes me think of various other things, including COVID, right? Where it's like, okay, so your project is just, is ceasefire just kind of stop the spread or something like that? It's like, we just have to stop this. We have no sort of broader plan for what political order would sort of accommodate and resolve this crisis in some more systemic way. Instead, it's just sort of stop the bleeding, after that. And so this, and this speaks really to the themes of your podcast with George Hoare and Alex Hochuli that, touches a lot on the post-political and the anti-political, strains that emerge, particularly after the end of the Cold War. And humanitarianism is definitely one of these. Something that strikes me and has struck me recently, and I thought about it in relation to your piece is, I was sort of, I'm not an expert on any of this, but I was thinking back to like the 1970s when you first had the emergence of something like Doctors Without Borders, Bernard Kouchner as a, kind of crucial figure coming out of the new left who really, reframes this kind of universalist mission in terms of humanitarianism. And this is actually controversial at the time because one of the first big animating projects is the Vietnamese boat people. Who are the Vietnamese boat people? Well, they're basically right-wing anti-communist refugees. I mean, not necessarily, but they're certainly framed that way by the communist government in Vietnam. And so, you're sort of taking an apolitical stance here. You're saying, these people's suffering is the important thing. Whatever political alignment we may or may not have with them or the Vietnamese government is irrelevant, right? What matters is attending to these people's suffering. And then at that same time, you still had kind of the last gasp of a sort of third worldist, these various national liberation movements, of which Palestine was really one of the foremost and most important. These two tendencies were really at odds, right? The political project of building of national liberation and building post-colonial states would have been identified with the Vietnamese, with Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese government that had won and consolidated control of Vietnam. And then the humanitarian one was saying, what we need to be concerned about isn't who's in charge of Vietnam, but the tragic fate of these boat people. So it strikes me that now it's almost as if, and perhaps this is just another way of making your point, which is like, it's as if nobody even sees the problem here or sees that there's a disconnect, between the kind of residual sympathy for some kind of Palestinian project and then this kind of humanitarian mission of attending to those, suffering as a result of these disastrous conflicts.
No, absolutely. And you're right to trace it back that far. I mean, it was famously like Foucault himself, Michel Foucault, the French kind of theorist of post-politics, he made a point of defending the rights of the boat people as part of his supposed anti-authoritarianism, the idea of human rights as opposed to the rights of sovereign states. So it goes back very far, while framed in the midst of the Cold War by Foucault as a blow against authoritarian state power. In effect, and particularly what it becomes by the era of the post-Cold War era and unipolarity, that vision is just post-political because it doesn't come to the idea of who is going to be in charge. What is the point of, which state is going to control a particular territory? What are they going to do with it? Do they have the right to manage that territory independently of any oversight by the international community? And are rights, the basic question, are rights best realized in a national framework, or are rights best realized in this globalist supranational framework? And all those questions are, effaced in this moralistic view of simply attending to human suffering and relieving human suffering. And the same thing is true of Palestine. And so that's why I think the resolution of this tension, like you say, essentially moves towards greater international intervention in the conflict. So they march, kind of the marchers, the Palestinian solidarity marchers, like you say, kind of march for a ceasefire. And some of them might chant about the slogan, Palestine will be free from river to the sea. But because there is no actual Palestinian agency of emancipation, and they're not extending their solidarity to any Palestinian political project, rather their solidarity is purely humanitarian, it inevitably means that all of that outpouring of support will end up being effectively political support for greater international intervention in the conflict. And this, I think, is evident, kind of in claims that Israel is committing war crimes, the implication that international justice needs to be done to restrain Israeli actions. There are some kind of who are demanding sanctions on Israel, and this has long been kind of part of Palestinian solidarity. So the whole thrust of the Palestinian solidarity movement is to use in the international community, which effectively means the West, to enhance Western power in restraining Israel in favor of relieving Palestinian suffering. And so that, I think, is very, that is the logic of what's playing out, precisely because the left that supports the Palestinians is unwilling to think in hard-headed and practical terms about what the politics of the situation is, but purely in humanitarian terms.
Perhaps one final question, and kind of turning back to your point about how, Israel has sort of refused to take responsibility for the situation created by its military and political victory over the Palestinian liberation movement. And that was in the context of the end of the Cold War. I would think that, it's interesting. I recently watched this movie, Carlos, about Carlos the Jackal, and you see it very directly there, right? Basically, all of the, he spends decades being a sort of hitman, essentially, for the Palestinian liberation cause. And event, when the Soviet Union dies, all the other Arab nations kind of don't really want anything to do with him anymore. The whole thing kind of evaporates. And so, you just see how once that source of support is gone, the whole thing just kind of falls apart. And so Israel was able to take advantage of that and essentially, consolidate its victory. I've been thinking, maybe the problem with Israel is you have these people like, basically Netanyahu, who sort of present themselves as the realists on some level, right? We're not these like warm and fuzzy peaceniks who want everybody to live happily ever after, or believe that that's a possibility. We know that we have to be hard in order to survive and blah, blah, blah. But, in some sense, it seems clear that these people are actually not realistic at all, in part because they refuse to contend with this reality. And I've been thinking about this in terms of, you have the more extreme fringes of that coalition where they're sort of saying, oh, yeah, we do just want to transfer the Palestinians out of Gaza and, force Egypt to take them and so on. And it's like, okay, let's actually game that out, because if you bring about that outcome, it's not clear at all that it actually resolves your problem. In fact, what it may do is, really poison the well of your relations with neighboring countries once again, after a sort of hard-won peace that, Kissinger himself was instrumental in the negotiations of. And at the same time, continue the same situation, which is that you have this malcontent population of displaced refugees who have no political stakes in any existing order. And so, these people who are kind of like, who might be framed as like the brutal realists who are willing to do war, whether positively or negatively, who are willing to do as many war crimes as necessary to, secure the borders and so on, they don't seem realistic to me at all. They seem like they're actually, some of the most delusional people in the whole thing, because they don't even seem to understand, that even taking these extreme actions, which would incur huge costs in various ways, wouldn't even solve the problem that they think they're facing. Maybe what Israel needs is a brutal realist, maybe something like Ariel Sharon before he dies, sort of unilaterally withdrawing from Gaza. I mean, it didn't solve the problem, and he was certainly a brutal and in many ways monstrous figure. But he did at least have a certain kind of strategic sense operating there, which I don't see much of anybody who does at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with a lot of what you said. And it's the mistake of often realism is just understood as political realism is understood in terms of, hard-headed militarism, a willingness to be ruthless, Machiavellian guile and manipulation, the kind of the caricatured image of the Kissinger-style diplomat. When it really kind of has to attend to, or political realism as properly understood, has to attend to underlying dynamics that go far beyond questions of military power, but involve basic questions of political sovereignty, nationhood, and also legitimacy. And those are things out of, on which military power ultimately rests and founders, if those things are not pursued properly. And so the question, I certainly think, by comparison to Ariel Sharon, I think, Netanyahu is, a highly opportunistic and tactical politician. But the kinds of electoral alliances he's been willing to forge, the way in which he's sought to remain in power, and the political projects he's pursued, not least, let it be remembered, not least in extending Israeli political and financial support to Hamas and Gaza as a way of dividing the Palestinians between Gaza and the West Bank. All of that indicates a lack of, like you say, just a lack of realism, in the sense of a lack of basic strategic foresight. It's tactics and opportunism, always at the expense of any long-term vision, let alone kind of a sensible strategy of how to get there. I think your characterization is apt, and the thing I would add to it is that ultimately it seems to me the question is that of a failure of the Israeli state. The victory that they simply can't, the scale of the victory from both in 1967 and in the early 1990s is so great that they have been unable to absorb it or fully reckon with it. And so you have this state that has all sorts of internal tensions, not least between kind of Ashkenazi Jewish communities, Mizrahi Jewish communities, the PM, the kind of Israeli equivalent of the PMC, and the Roughnecks who support Likud. All of these kinds of tensions are then layered over the underlying basic tension that Israel has political control over a dispossessed population that they're unwilling to, like you say, give any kind of stake in a political settlement. That seems like a nation essentially that is floundering. So however brutal and ruthless the Israeli assault, what's clear politically is just how weak the Israelis are. And at the same time, the only side that is weaker and more powerless are the Palestinians. And the left, whatever succor the left can draw from Israel's defensiveness shouldn't be mistaken as a gain for the Palestinians, because it's a situation in which the international community, will most likely step in at the expense of the Palestinians and ultimately at the expense of the Israelis, because greater international involvement simply means that there is less scope for the development of independent nations of any kind, whether binational, Jewish, Arab, or whatever in the region. And then just a quick thought on Carlos. Yeah, it was actually you tweeting about it. It reminded me that I'd been meaning to see it for a while, and I watched it, and it's well worth watching. And I'd recommend kind of listeners and viewers to go check it out. And I remember the thing that stayed with me, in addition to the end of the Cold War, like you say, was just how quickly Palestinian revolutionary politics itself kind of disintegrates and becomes caught up in all their kind of machinations of Arab intelligence services, as manipulation by the Soviets, and their own kind of vociferous tendencies, and just how brief that kind of moment of a real any kind of meaningful political vision for the Palestinians that isn't just caught up in intra-Arab kind of rivalries and strife. It's a very brief moment, and that I thought came across well in the film as well.
Well, might be another one for your podcast to discuss. You did a great episode on the Baader-Meinhof complex recently, so
yeah, indeed, we might end up talking about Carlos. So yeah, it's a good thought.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Phil. Always a pleasure to have you on our pages, and great to talk.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me on. The pleasure's all mine.
So that is it for this week's Compact Conversations. Thanks, Phil. And as always, remember that Compact is an independent reader-supported publication. We need your subscriptions to keep doing what we're doing. So if you've not, please go to compactmag.com/subscribe. And please also remember to subscribe to this podcast. And if you like what we're doing, give us 5 stars. Thanks, and see you next time.